Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Sweet November's Rainy Day Fairies and the Horizon Lines Wildflower Meadow. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some pattern paper from the Cartabella Secret Garden 6x6. So I tear out the sheet that I want to use as my color palette inspiration and tuck that under my cardstock panel, and I'm going to jump right in with the coloring. So because there are no dies for this stamp set, I'm going to be doing an entire scene, and I am starting with my sky. I'm using BG quadruple 0 and just laying in a little bit of a streaky background to give the illusion of some wispy clouds. Now, there are some raindrops in this scene, but I'm imagining that it's taking place after the storm has passed. So the sky is going to be a little bit on the lighter side, and that way it won't get too dark and moody since the pattern paper is already kind of dark and moody. I'm switching next to the BG triple 0 and starting to darken up a few places. And I am going to color right over the fairies' wings because I do want those to look transparent. So I am going to add some of that blue right into there. And I am just carefully coloring around everything else that I don't want to be blue. The nice thing about using these super pale colors like this, though, is that you can go back in with your colorless blender and clean things up a bit. So, yeah, now I'm going to add in a little bit of a darker blue and a little bit more of a moodier blue just so we match the tone of the pattern paper. I'm going to bring in B41. I'm going to be a lot more selective where I place this color, just picking and choosing a few different places. Also adding it to places that would have a bit of shadow, like under the large leaf and the flower, or next to the fairies themselves, and just adding a little bit of that into the sky and trying to extend those lines so that they come out on either side if there's an object that's in front of it. Then I'm going to start blending back out in the reverse, and you'll notice that the entire time that I'm doing this sky background, I'm holding my marker far back on the actual barrel and using more of the side of the nib rather than the tip so that I can get those nice long strokes, which are going to help everything just blend together really well and fill in that background as quickly as I can. So I'm blending back over the B41 with the B triple 0, just pulling that color out into the middle tone areas. And then I'm going to bring in that BG quadruple 0 and just go over the edges of that once again. And I'm not taking the color all the way to the edges because I am going to trim this panel down quite a bit. I'll go back to that B41 and add a little bit of a shadow to my raindrops, just picking like one side of it toward the bottom edge or the side for the ones that are dripping down to add a little bit of depth to those. And then I'll blend that out with the BG quadruple 0. And then I'm going to take my colorless blender and just go over the edge of that BG quadruple 0 and kind of bring that white cardstock back to the forefront again by pushing that color deeper into the fibers of the paper. Next we'll move on to the grass, and I chose G40, G43, and G46. And I'm going to start with my G40 and start to just block in where I want that grass to be. And even though I'm coloring all the way through those flowers, most of those are going to get cut off as well. There's only going to be a little bit showing on either side. So I don't have to go quite that far, but I wasn't exactly sure where I was going to be cutting it. So I did start to just fill those in, especially when you're doing these long swiping motions. It's just as easy to extend that out a bit. So then I'm going to deepen that up with the G43, starting to add in some shadows, kind of mapping out where those are going to be, like underneath the fairies' feet. and also underneath the little worm and at the base of the flowers where their leaves are kind of poking up. So I'll just add that in and kind of deepen up those shadows, make that color look a little bit richer. And then I'll come in with my darkest shade, which is going to be the G46. And again, just bring out even more depth with that. So you'll know from my usual videos that I prefer to color darkest to lightest. The only times that I reverse that is when I'm coloring backgrounds or hair. So in this video, we're actually going to be reversing that process fairly often, but either one is fine. It's really just your comfort level. So coloring lightest to darkest, I feel does use a little bit more ink. And so over the years, I've just gotten used to coloring darkest to lightest. So that's the way that I prefer. But when it's something that I'm unsure of, something that I don't do as often, and I just want to be a little bit more careful and take my time a little bit more, that's when I start doing lightest to darkest, because it's so much easier to layer up those colors and go darker than it is to take them away. It's really hard to take the color away with Copics. You can do it a little bit with your colorless blender and stuff, but it can also get really muddy that way. So just building up the color when you're unsure of what you're doing can really make a difference for you. So I'm adding in some extra darkness to those leaves near the flowers. And then I'm also going to use these shades to do the stem of the flower that the fairy on the left is holding. And I want anything that falls behind the fairy's wings to be a shade lighter. So I switched to the G43 for that part of the stem. And then I'm going to move on to my fairy's skin, and I'm going to do both of them at once, but I'm going to do two different skin tones. So for the fairy on the left with the curly hair, I'm going to go with a slightly darker skin tone. I'm going to use the darkest three shades there, the E00, E11, and E13. Starting with the E13, so now I am switching to darkest to lightest, blending that out with the E11. I laid those shadows in up under her hairline, along the side of her ear, on her hand, and I made it a little bit heavier on her legs since those would be cast in more shadow, since they wouldn't be getting as much light as her face would because that's upturned. And so I only used that lightest shade, the E00, on her face. For the second fairy, I'm going to go with a little bit lighter skin tone, and so I'll be using the lighter three shades, the E000, E00, and E11. And I just colored her basically the same way, but just went with the lighter combo. And then I'm going to add some rosy cheeks to both of these sweet little fairy girls using R20 and R22. I think that combo works well for both skin tones. And then while I have the pinks out, I'm going to continue coloring with them. I'll bring in R00, and I'm going to do the petals of the large flower that the fairy on the left is holding. So I'm starting with the R22 on the petals that are on the top layer, and blending out with the R20, just adding in kind of like a streaky look. And then I'll take that R20 and use that for the tops of the underside of the petals. So any petals that are on the opposite side of the fairy, that's the underside of that flower, and so I wanted it to be just a little bit lighter. So I blended out the top petals with the R00, and then I use that as the mid-tone for the underside of the petals. And then I'll bring in R000 to finish off the undersides. And then I am going to go back with my darkest shades and kind of add in some more flicks of colors. I want that to be kind of like a little variation in the petals, and so I'm just going to kind of blend those out, but not completely. I want some of that veining to be in those petals, both on the ones that are on top and the ones on the underside. And then I did color in one flower over to the right hand side down at the bottom so that we have that visual symmetry with those being cat-a-corner to each other. Then I'm going to use YG41, YG45, and YG46 for the large leaf that the fairy on the right is holding. And again, this is the underside of that leaf that we are seeing, only the underside. So I wanted to go with shades that had a little bit of boldness to them, but were also kind of a little bit paler, if that makes sense. So they're a little bit more on the blue toned side of things, which I think goes really well with that pattern paper. So I started with the G46 and kind of outlined the leaf and added in that veining, drawing attention to that. And now I'm coming in with the YG45 and starting to pull that darkest color out into the mid-tone. But I'm still leaving plenty of room for the highlight because that's what's really going to make it look like it's the underside of the leaf. So I'll come in with the YG41 then and just go around and fill everything in, coloring in those little circular motions to kind of break up any harsh edges and make sure that everything is blended really well. But I do want to leave those veining lines showing because we want that little bit of contrast in there since the artist has already drawn them there. And once I'm happy with how that leaf is looking, I will fill in the stem. Next, I'm going to tackle their hair. I'm going to begin with the fairy on the right, and I wanted her to be more of a blonde, kind of like a darker blonde. I'm using E51, E53, E55, and E57. Again, I'm starting with my lightest shade, that E51, and kind of mapping out the places that are going to be the darkest in the end result. So I'm just laying in that color and then building it up as I continue down into the other markers until I get the look I like. That way, if I decide that it's dark enough and I don't want to add the E57, I could. But in this case, I wanted to because I like that contrast. I like that it provides the low lights in the hair, which really makes the highlights stand out in contrast. So I went all the way up to the E57 and then I'm just working my way back down until I have everything blended back out. But again, I'm going to leave a little bit of that streakiness there because that gives the hair its texture and movement. And then I'm going to switch to a different combo for the curly haired girl. I'm going with E23, E25, E27, and E29. And curly hair is completely different. I color that in a totally different way. So I'm going to show that to you. This is a great way to just illustrate different types of hair since we've got one of each in this little scene here. So I'm taking my lightest shade, that E23, and just doing like an underlayer of all of the hair, just filling that in completely. Then I'm going to come in with the next shade, which is the E25, and I'm going to start adding in some little scribbles close around the face, and then I'll move out into dots towards the top of the head, and then at the very, very top of the head, I'm not going to add anything. And I'm going to keep building that way now with the E27, just adding a few more of those scribbles and dots. And the darker the color, the closer to the face I put it. So it will be dark around the face and then it'll get lighter as it goes up towards the edges of the curls. And it looks kind of odd at the beginning, but once you get it all finished and all of the layers are there, it really does start to come together and look like curly hair. And I'm sure there are other ways to color curly hair as well, but this has been a way that I have found that really works well for me, and I am happy with the end result. So yeah, I did decide that I wanted to go just slightly darker with a couple more little areas, so I pulled in the E49 and only added just a few of those to give the deepest, darkest like low lights. Then I'm going to bring in some yellow since we've got several shades of yellow in that pattern paper. I'm going to use Y quadruple 0, Y11, and Y13 for the top of the pink flower. I'll also do one of the small flowers down at the bottom and the center of this pink small flower over on the right. And then I'm going to darken up that combo by taking away the Y quadruple 0 and adding in the Y15. And I will do the raincoat for this little fairy on the right. And I decided to give her rain boots to match. So I'm using that Y15 to lay in any shadows where there are little creases, like in the toe of the boots, or any areas that are kind of like in shadow, like the edges of her arms or the seam of the coat where it comes together in the front. Blending out with the Y13, and then I'll use the Y11 as my highlight. And then I'm going to move on to some peachy tones, and I'll do the worm. I'm using YR00, YR01, and YR02. And there are some large peach toned flowers in that pattern paper, so I wanted to have that color in the mix. So I'll also do another one of the flowers over on the left and just start with the darkest shade and blend out with the other two towards the tips of the petals. I went back and forth on what color to do the other rain jacket and rain boots, but I ultimately decided to go with a brighter green since we do have so much green in that pattern paper. So I used YG01, YG03, and YG05. I wanted something that was a little bit brighter and punchy so that it would stand out against the other greens that I'd already used. So I am coloring carefully around those fairy wings. I am going to color them green as well, at least the parts that are over top of the jacket. But I want those parts that are over the jacket to be a little bit lighter. So I'm using those darker shades kind of to add the shadows around and then fill in with the lighter ones. And then I went back to my R20 and R22 for that last flower over on the left, since that was going to show in the ultimate design. I brought in Y15 for that flower's center, and then I am going to trim this panel down with my paper trimmer. Now I'm going to go back to that Cartabella Secret Garden 6x6 paper pad and choose a couple of more prints to go along with the original one that I had pulled out to use as our color palette inspiration. And honestly, in this pad there are so many great options that I really did have a hard time deciding. I did bring in that yellow because, again, I just wanted something that would brighten up the card a bit, since that background pattern paper is kind of dark and moody, which I liked the vibe of, but I didn't want it to go too dark. I wanted to just lighten it up a little bit, so I thought that that yellow would work well for that. And then I wanted two more prints, so I was kind of just flipping back and forth, trying to decide if I wanted to go with greens or pinks. But I had this scrap of a pink stripe that I thought would work really well. And then I also had another darker pink piece that I thought went well with that as well. So I just was double checking and making sure that I didn't want to go with the greens, but I decided to stick with the pinks. So these are the pieces that I'm going to be trimming down. I also trimmed down the focal panel so that it would be small enough to fit behind the second largest of the Lawn Fawn lacy rectangle stackables, and I used that to die cut that yellow pattern paper so that I could create a frame around this little scene. So I'm adding just a really thin bead of glue with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue on the inside edge of that frame, and then I'm going to line that up over the background. Make sure that I have the whole thing on there straight, and then I'll just smooth that into place. I'll clean up any glue residue with my finger, and then I'm going to pop this into my MISTI so that I can stamp a sentiment. And there are a lot of really great sentiments in that Rainy Day Fairwees stamp set, but all of them were too big for this scene. I needed something that was super tiny. So I pulled out an old set from Hello Bluebird. It's the Typed Every Day. And I used the phrase "sending hugs," which fit perfectly up in that top left corner. I stamped that down twice using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And then I'm going to pop a Lawn Fawn Ballet Slippers card base in my MISTI, and I'll stamp on the inside with some bubblegum ink. I chose the snail from the Rainy Day Fairwees set, and then another sentiment from the Typed Every Day. And as I went to stamp that down the first time, I realized that it wasn't gonna stamp down correctly because there was like a little bit of residue on the stamps themselves. So I just cleaned that off and then re-stamped, and I had to stamp that down a couple of times to make sure it was nice and bold, but in the end I got there. And then I'm going to start assembling this card. So I'm going to take the background pattern paper, the one that has all the florals on there, and I'm going to glue that to fit the entire front of my card. It is an A2 standard size card, so it's 4 1/4 tall by 5 1/2 wide. And then I'm going to glue this pink striped piece across the center of the card horizontally. And just make sure that's on there straight, so I have the same amount of space at the top and bottom. And then I'm going to take this darker pink print and lay that right over the center of the pink stripe. And I really like how that's looking, so I've added some foam tape to the back of the focal panel, so that will add a bit of dimension to the card. And I'm going to peel off those release papers and line that up in the center. I'm going to set that down lightly just to make sure it's on there nice and straight before I press it down into place. And then I'll just carefully go around that sentiment in case it's still a little bit wet. And then to finish off this card, I'm going to grab a white gel pen and I'm going to add a little shine mark on the raindrops. I'm going to do that on the opposite side of the shadow. So wherever I put the highlight, I'm going to add a little extra highlight with that white gel pen. And that really helps those stand out and makes them look like water droplets that are catching the light after the storm. And then I'm also going to add some little sparkly details around the fairy wings. So I'm going to add some little plus signs and then little dots around them, just to add like a little bit of, I don't know, like magic in the air. I'm not adding it to the wings themselves, just around the wings, because I do also want to add in some Stardust stickles. And if you put the Stardust stickles over the white gel pen, it'll just start to make it dissolve. So I'm going to add the Stardust stickles to the fairy's wings and just give a little bit of actual sparkle to those. And then I'm also going to add it to the water droplets, but this time in the darkest shadowed areas. So we'll have the white gel pen on one side and then the sparkle over the shadow on the other side of these little raindrops. And that is going to finish off this card. So I'm going to lift that up so you can see it in a bit more detail. And I'll give you another peek at the inside. I really had so much fun coloring this one, and so I hope that you guys enjoyed it too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. The products I use will be listed and linked in the description bar below the video, so if you'd like to pick up anything for yourself, you can find those links there. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye-bye!